In July 1993, archaeologists in northern Israel discovered a broken stone tablet dating to the late 9th century BCE. This fragment came to be known as Fragment A of the Tel Dan stele. A year later, two more pieces of the same tablet were discovered, giving us fragments B1 and B2. Though far from complete, enough text was visible for archaeologists to make translations and understand the purpose of this tablet. The stone was to commemorate a decisive victory of an Aramaean king over the Israelites. With Baal-Hadad fighting on the side of his appointed king, he was granted victory over the king of Israel and the house of David. But does this inscription really mention David by name? Maybe. Or maybe not. Debate continues to this day about the actual translation of the phrase. It could be translated to mean House of David, or House of the Beloved, indicating a fictive ancestor or even a god, as Baal-Hadad was fighting on the opposing side. It could also mean a relative of the king and not a name at all. However it translates, this single inscription remains the closest thing we have to actual evidence that King David existed. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. In the beginning of 1 Samuel chapter 15, the high priest Samuel begins speaking as if he were Yahweh. What I mean by that is that Samuel states that Yahweh sent him to anoint the king, as if he's serving as a mere priest or prophet. But then the text states, "Now hear the voice of Yahweh." The text then goes on to say, "Thus said Yahweh Sabaoth," and continues on with the words spoken by Yahweh himself. So we could read this as Samuel speaking on behalf of his God, or Samuel as the earthly incarnation of Yahweh. Since we're talking about ancient high priests, it's unlikely that such a distinction was even implied. The text hasn't yet fully separated the high priest from his role as Yahweh's earthly vessel. So maybe Samuel is speaking on behalf of Yahweh, or in this instance, Samuel is Yahweh. Or you can get a prophet who can do both. Here, Yahweh tells Saul that he has chosen to exact revenge on King Amalek of Edom for his attack against the Israelites. If you're confused about who Amalek is, or what exactly he did to incur Yahweh's wrath, you'll need to go all the way back to the book of Exodus. Amalek is the grandson of Esau, Jacob's brother, which means he was born around the time that the Israelites were first brought to Egypt by Joseph, so about 400 years before the Exodus story, or about 1100 years before the time of Saul. So when Amalek was about 400 years old, the Israelites were heading out of Egypt led by Moses, and they were attacked. During the battle, they discovered that as long as Moses held his hands up, the Israelites would be winning. But if he dropped his hands, the Amalekites would be winning. So Moses' pals propped up his arms, and the Israelites defeated the Amalekites in battle. So now, nearly 700 years after his crime of attacking Israel during the Exodus, Yahweh has decided that it's finally time for King Amalek to lose another battle. So Yahweh Sabaoth, Lord of the heavenly army, commands Saul to attack the Amalekites. But he doesn't just want the oldest man in the Bible to die, but for all of his soldiers, along with every other man, woman, child, infants, and all of his animals to die as well. Now, are we to assume here that the author intended for Amalek to be the oldest living person in the Bible? No. If you recall the first episode concerning the book of Joshua, we covered the fact that the characters in there seemed to not know that the Israelites had been roaming the wilderness for 40 years. In fact, it seemed that the journey from Egypt to Jericho lasted exactly 1 year, beginning with the Passover in Egypt and ending with the ritual circumcision and celebration of the Passover near the River Jordan. Some of these tales include the 40-year wandering, while others do not. It's the same with the book of Judges. Judges was a compilation of old folklore that wouldn't fit anywhere else in the fictive history, but the stories were important to the people, so they were inserted after Joshua. In reality, they should have been included in the book of Genesis, going right alongside Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So, when characters who interacted with Moses, like King Amalek, make an appearance, we have to remember that, according to some traditions, Moses and Saul may have only been separated by a handful of years, not many centuries. Anyway, Saul gathers his army, 210,000 soldiers this time, instead of 3,000 or only 600. He marches his army to the city of Amalek, and there gives warning to the Kenites, who are allied with Amalek, that their buddy is about to catch a beating. The Kenites then pack up and get out, and Saul goes on a destructive rampage, destroying cities and killing men, women, and children. He even kills all the babies, just as Yahweh had commanded. But what he didn't do was slaughter all of the animals. This lack of animal butchery angered Yahweh so much that he spoke personally to Saul and stated that he regretted ever making the man king. Samuel came along and asked what was going on, and Saul says that he was saving the best livestock so he could sacrifice the animals to Yahweh instead of just wasting them. Apparently, Yahweh didn't want the livestock sacrificed. He wanted it wasted. In 1 Samuel 15:22, Samuel tells Saul that Yahweh does not delight in burnt offerings, and so his gesture would have been meaningless, and his sin is as great as the sin of divination. Wait, hang on. Has Samuel not read the previous 7 books? Or has he not even read the first half of this book? Since when does Yahweh not accept burnt offerings of animals? This tradition literally goes all the way back to the very first sacrifice ever made by mankind with Cain and Abel, and it is literally commanded as part of worship. In fact, burnt offerings is the only acceptable form of sacrifice in certain circumstances. And Yahweh has been giving instructions on divination since he first started speaking with Abraham. So what gives? What is this about? And is this really an appropriate reason to reject Saul as king? If you remember in the last episode when we discussed Saul making sacrifice himself instead of asking Samuel to do it, and because of that he was rejected as king, this is another version of that same idea. Just like Saul had multiple origin stories, multiple tales of how he became king, he has multiple stories of why he was later rejected as king, or why he didn't found a dynasty. You see, there were 2 feuding groups of people in the post-exilic period trying to establish themselves as legitimate rulers of Israel. To do this, they invented grand legends of their ancestors who were the best rulers. One camp used Saul, while the other used David. Whether or not these 2 figures ever existed is still a matter of debate, but the best anyone can do is find a single inscription that might translate into the House of David. And even if that translation is accurate, it only means that a group of people were identified by that title. And we've already discussed how frequently these people invented fictive ancestors for all sorts of reasons. Anyway, as these stories grew, David became connected with another leader who seems to be equally fictive, Solomon. This established David as a dynastic ruler, whereas Saul was a solitary king. So the compilers of the books of Kings needed a reason for Saul to not establish a dynasty, the same way they needed Moses to not be the person who led the Israelites into Israel, because they already had stories about Joshua doing that. The first we read about was in chapter 13, when he offered sacrifice himself, and the second, here in chapter 15, is when he didn't kill enough animals, but instead wanted to sacrifice them. These are probably two versions of the same story, the idea that a king was taking upon himself the prerogatives of the high priest. These stories, as well as Samuel writing the rules that limit the king's power and other scenes, is to show that the Israelites no longer needed a king, because the priest could manage better than any monarch. Even asking for a king was a sin against Yahweh. In both of these stories of Saul and the sacrifices, his crime is assuming the job of the priest. But only in the second case do we get this idea that burnt offerings are taboo. This particular idea seems like a much later addition to the story, possibly as late as the 2nd century BCE. Zoroastrian influence had been steadily creeping in since the end of the exile, and one detail, specifically, would cause issues with the temple practices, and that was Ahura Mazda's distaste for animal sacrifice. Even when the Persian Empire was shattered and they lost their control over Israel, the influences of Zoroastrianism were still growing, as their ideas had then taken a life of their own and would continue to shape Judaism and later Christianity for centuries. Now, if you read the first half of 1 Samuel, and you remove the repeated repudiations of King Saul, the narrative actually reads much more smoothly. Sort of like the way if you removed all the little intervening segments in the book of Judges, where it talks about this is the reason that the Israelites are being punished by repeated invasion by the Philistines, then the stories of the different judges would carry on without interruption. These repudiations of Saul are all later additions inserted by later editors to tone down the pro-monarchical material by inserting their own opinions of the monarchy. So here, Saul understands that he has transgressed against Yahweh, and he tells Samuel that he wants to repent. But Samuel says that Yahweh does not change his mind. It is becoming increasingly apparent that Samuel does not listen to my podcast. The Amalekite king is then brought forward and slaughtered, not by Saul, but by Samuel. Saul bows before the priest, and Yahweh vocalizes his regret for having ever chosen Saul to be king. There's a palpable finality in this scene. Saul is left unforgiven. His priest deals the final blow against the Amalekites, and Yahweh has forsaken him. His entire reign has been deemed a mistake. This is the end for Saul, whether he knows it or not. The next chapter begins with Yahweh telling Samuel to travel to Bethlehem to track down a new king. It's sort of like all the reboots of creation in the first half of Genesis. When one plan fails, Yahweh hits the reset button without ever addressing the fundamental flaws in his plan. Now at this point, Samuel raises concerns about his journey to Bethlehem, fearing that Saul will kill him for going off to anoint a new king, which leaves us asking how Saul would even know the purpose of Samuel's departure. He frequently travels around, going missing for multiple consecutive chapters, and this never raises suspicions. So what's the problem now? Did another prophet come along and tell Saul, "Beware the Ides of 1 Samuel"? To which Saul would reply, "Wouldn't that be the last chapter? Because we're now in chapter 16. Such a scene might fit in chapter 28 after Saul has started to lose his mind and then visits the Witch of Endor, but it doesn't fit here. What fits even less is Yahweh's suggestion on how to needlessly excuse his absence. The patron deity of Israel tells Samuel to bring a heifer to Bethlehem and tells Saul that he's going there to sacrifice it on the altar. Why does this excuse make no sense? Because Samuel is the high priest at Shiloh, the primary shrine of the region at that time. It would be like a professional mechanic telling his wife he's going to take his car over to Jiffy Lube because it needs a total engine rebuild. This is exactly what you do not do if you're trying to avoid acting suspicious. I'll bet you $50 that the night Yahweh slept with Mary, he came up with a lame excuse like this for his absence, and Asherah caught him. Anyway, back to Samuel. Yahweh will once again personally select the man who will become the king of Israel, and that is who Samuel must anoint. And when Samuel reaches Bethlehem, he is led by Yahweh to a man named Jesse, who had 8 sons. At least according to 1 Samuel, he has 8. But in the book of Chronicles, he only has 7 sons. Samuel believes that Jesse's oldest son must be the chosen king, because he, like Saul, is tall and handsome. But Yahweh tells Samuel not to look upon his outward appearance or his height, because he has already rejected the eldest son for the contents of his heart. So maybe we're making progress here. Rather than choose the tallest man or draw lots, we're going to find the best man for the job, and the all-knowing Yahweh is going to help us with that process. Samuel then approaches the second oldest son, but again, Yahweh tells him that he too has been rejected. On and on it goes until all of Jesse's sons have been rejected. Confused, since Yahweh led him here to pick one of his sons, Samuel asks if perhaps Jesse has any other children. And Jesse replies that, his youngest is out tending flocks. Perhaps Yahweh could have mentioned that in the beginning, or maybe led Samuel to the fields where the future king was, instead of to a house where he wasn't. And perhaps if you have 8 sons and only one of them has a job, you might want to just skip the first 7. I mean, it would seem to me that at that point they would be beyond consideration. So David strolls into the house after work, and Yahweh points him out to Samuel, and Samuel instantly anoints him with oil. This act forever links David with the Spirit of Yahweh. And when he does, the Spirit of Yahweh instantly departs from Saul. At this point in the story, we get one of the clearest examples in the entire Bible of how the authors enjoy redundancy. As soon as the good spirit of Yahweh departs Saul, we're told that an evil spirit from Yahweh began tormenting him. His servants then cry out, "Behold, an evil spirit from Yahweh is tormenting thee." Did I mention they enjoy redundancy? This also shows the middle theological view that evil stems from Yahweh. They've shed the majority of their polytheistic beliefs, but they haven't yet adopted the Zoroastrian idea of personified evil. So Yahweh is the source of both good and bad. While Saul is suffering from this demonic possession, an affliction he'll struggle with for the remainder of this book, he asks his servants to find him someone who can play music. The idea here is that music might drive away the evil spirits and calm his nerves. If you recall the episodes concerning the First Temple, music was a means of invoking Yahweh and bringing his spirit into a mortal man. We saw another example of this earlier in this same book, when the minstrels used music to bring Yahweh into Saul. Here, in chapter 16, Saul is trying to replicate that event. His servants find a young musician whose talents are able to lift the curse of Yahweh. This musician happens to be none other than the boy David, who was sent to Saul with an offering of bread, wine, and goat by his father Jesse. So here we have another instance of a future king associated with the sacred offerings of the First Temple Ascension ritual, and a second story of how David came to be associated with King Saul. Was he hand-chosen by Yahweh for the contents of his heart and anointed by Samuel? Or was he chosen by Saul's servants for his musical talent? Two introductions to David in a single chapter. Like Saul, he has multiple origins, and the editors included them all. So David comes along, and his strumming drives out the evil spirit of Yahweh, and Saul finds relief. So that's it. Those are the only two origin stories of David, the first dynastic king of Israel. Until you get to the next chapter. Chapter 17 begins with another attack on Israel by the cursed Philistines. Saul gathers his army to do battle with the invaders, and Jesse's sons are among the soldiers. All of them except the youngest, who was still tending the flocks. David, who has not been taken away by Samuel or serving as a palace minstrel, is still working for his father. In this story, he's bringing food and supplies from his father's house to the army to give to his older brothers. Along the way, he sees the Philistine army and their champion, Goliath. Now, this champion was so fearsome that the entire Israelite army was afraid to face him. And so the Philistines just stood around waiting for a fight that wasn't coming, which seems to me like it's a pretty boring invasion. We're told in 1 Samuel 17, 16-17, that Goliath stepped forward and stood in the open for 40 days, waiting for anyone brave enough to fight him. Now, why were they so afraid? Because of how big he was? His height is listed as 6 cubits and a span, which translates to 9 feet 9 inches. Yeah, I'd be scared of that guy too. But that height, 6 cubits and a span, only shows up in the medieval copies. In every copy of Samuel, from before the time of the Crusades, Goliath's height is listed as 4 cubits and a span, or about 6 feet 9 inches. Now that's still pretty big, especially for the time, but not really any taller than King Saul, who was a full head taller than any other man in Israel. And this detail, the height of Goliath, is actually a pretty good method for determining which version of the Hebrew Bible your Old Testament is based on. If the taller height, 6 cubits and a span, is used, then your Bible is based on something called the Masoretic text, a medieval copy of the Jewish scriptures. If the shorter height, 4 cubits and a span, is used, it's likely either the Vulgate or the Septuagint. So David sees this champion, possibly wonders why the Philistines chose to just stand there for a month and a half rather than steamroll the cowering Israelites, and decides that he can take care of him. Granted, he's not battle-trained, nor has he ever even been in a fight with another man. He's got moxie, and sometimes that's enough. Or perhaps he realizes that he's the protagonist now, and Samuel and Saul have both taken a back seat in the narrative, so there's no way he's going to die. So he introduces himself to King Saul and offers to fight the not-so-giant giant. Saul is a bit skeptical, so David lists his qualifications, regaling the king with tales of how he personally prized lambs from the jaws of lions that have attacked his flocks. I'm pretty sure every shepherd has told that story at least once, just like every fisherman has caught a 10-pound bass that later flopped out of the boat as soon as he removed the hook. With nothing to lose but a random kid who runs errands for his dad, Saul tells him to have at it. He attempts to dress David in his own armor, but it doesn't fit since David's a shrimp and Saul is a Jewish Goliath. So in true underdog fashion, David marches out to the battlefield to face off with the mighty champion with only his sling, a staff, and a few rocks as weapons. Goliath feels that the Israelites are insulting him by sending a boy, especially since he seems to be armed with only a stick. But the guy's willing to kill him anyway. The two get ready to fight, one champion against another, something that only happens in the Iliad. And David launches a rock from his sling straight into Goliath's noggin. The giant topples, and David uses the man's own sword to lop off his head. The Philistines all flee in terror, and the Israelites give chase, butchering them as they run. David then takes the severed head of Goliath to Jerusalem and stored the man's armor in his tent. Saul then asked David who the hell he was, and at that point learned that he was the son of Jesse. So what are we to make of this, one of the most famous stories in the entire Old Testament? Let's begin with David's claim to fistfight lions. This was a popular detail in hero stories in the Mediterranean world, showing up in the lives of Samson and Hercules, both of whom borrowed the idea from Gilgamesh. Now the unprepared boy faces the champion, the boy without armor who faces the well-armed, the small boy who faces a giant. These details are all meant to convey the same point, a point that's plainly stated by David when he faces Goliath. David tells the Philistine that he's armed with only a sword and spear and shield, but that David has come armed with the Lord of armies. It's gods that win wars, not weapons. The text tells us that war is Yahweh's domain, which is another surviving reference to Yahweh's origins as a war god. And Israel has long identified as an underdog nation, usually because it's being conquered by its much larger neighbors. At the end of the scene, David takes the giant's armor to his tent. But this makes no sense, unless we're seeing a detail from another version of the story that's kind of been shoehorned into this one. In this chapter, David is a shepherd who's running errands for his dad. He wasn't sleeping among the soldiers, and he certainly wouldn't have had his own tent. The notion of a champion living in his own tent amongst the soldiers who comes out to crush enemy champions isn't historical, and doesn't even fit with the biblical narrative. It's almost certainly borrowed from Homer. But the idea that David, or at least the killer of Goliath, was a well-known soldier who might take trophies and have his own tent, does appear in 2 Samuel. But we'll come back to that in a moment. At the end of the story, Saul has no idea who David is, and he must inquire about his identity. This story, the story of David and Goliath, is a third and separate introduction story for David. He wasn't an anointed king brought here by Samuel, and he certainly wasn't playing music for Saul every time the evil of Yahweh crept into the king. There were multiple stories concerning this character, and possibly these stories didn't even concern David, but were added to his legend as he grew in popularity. When the compilers were trying to work all of these into a single narrative, these contradictions arose. But perhaps the biggest problem with this story is the one I just mentioned. It's that this story repeats in 2 Samuel 21. While battling the Philistines, the Israelites encounter 4 giants, including Goliath of Gath. And here, a man named Elhanan, which means God is gracious, kills Goliath. There was another giant in this chapter that has 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, who was also killed at the same time. Now this man, Elhanan, was a warrior who fought alongside David. Later, in the book of Chronicles, the story would be changed to have Elhanan killing Goliath's brother. And later, in medieval times, rabbis would make the claim that Elhanan was another name for King David. So what is going on here? How does any of this make sense? Most scholars believe that Elhanan was the original killer of Goliath. But as the legends of David grew, he collected many popular stories, like fighting lions with his bare hands and killing giant Philistines. As David was the more popular character, Elhanan faded into obscurity. So his tale of killing Goliath was placed later in the narrative, after David had already accomplished the same feat. He's also made into a servant of David, so that even if Elhanan did kill the giant, he did so while working under David, so the legendary king still gets the credit. Then the chronicler and later rabbis noticed the contradictions, and each came up with their own solution to this problem. So if David did exist, and there are currently no references in archaeology to the man himself, only vague references that might indicate a group of people, it's unlikely that he was the man originally credited with killing Goliath of Gath. In the next episode, we will take a look at David and his complex relationship with King Saul. But before we wrap this up, I have a couple of listener questions to get to. John asks, what is your greatest pet peeve in regards to religion and religious people? For that, I would have to say it would be embracing a liberal interpretation of Scripture. These texts are often quite clear in their meaning. This is acceptable when lessons like treating your neighbors with kindness is taught. But when Jesus tells slaves that they have to obey their masters, suddenly we're talking about a parable, and it couldn't possibly mean that Jesus endorsed slavery. I find it aggravating when people try to force an ancient text to conform with modern morality. As apologists like to point out, it was written in a different time, and it had a different view of the world than we do today. Accept that. Accept that the Bible states what it states. Otherwise, you're just using the book like a sock puppet to say whatever it is that you personally believe. And if you're going to do that, you don't need to hide behind a book to do it. Next up, we have Richard, who has written in a few times before. Richard asks, I was reading about the book of Enoch, and it said the term Enochian Jews has been used by some for what I think you would call the First Temple Jews. Is that correct? Yes, that is correct. Those scholars who accept the major theological differences that existed between First and Second Temple, they view the Book of Enoch as a product of Jews descended from that First Temple sect. Now, what gets really confusing is when scholars attempt to match the theological phases to the archaeological stages of development in Jerusalem. What we would call First Temple theology has some Zoroastrian influence, and it is very temple-centric. It seems to match more closely with the time of the rebuilt temple financed by Cyrus the Great after the exile. And Second Temple theology seems to fit better in the Hellenistic age and has been argued to have begun during the Hasmonean dynasty. If that's the case, then what we really have are three distinct periods, not two. The first being pure polytheism, with Baal-Hadad, Dagon, Asherah, El-Elyon, Nehushtan, and others being worshipped in Israel prior to the Babylonian exile. Though this likely would have been enshrined scattered all over the region and not in a single centralized temple. A second period being established when a grand temple was built by Cyrus, and the early effects of Zoroastrianism influence were being felt. This period, beginning with the end of the exile, was retrojected into pre-exilic times with legends of Solomon. When we read of the Great Temple of Solomon before the exile, we're actually seeing references to the Temple of Cyrus after the exile. This would come to be known as the First Temple period, and finally, around 140 to 120 BCE, a group of priests in Jerusalem began the process of reforming the theology, which culminated in the construction of Herod's temple in 20 BCE, which would be destroyed by the Romans 90 years later. This period, from 140 BC to 70 AD, would be referred to as the Second Temple period. With each stage of redaction being retrojected into history and many of these stories being recycled legends from earlier times, it's impossible to say with any certainty exactly when these different ideas developed. But as long as we're willing to accept the idea that the compilers and editors of these texts were willing to rewrite their history for personal gain, then the idea of the much later dating makes sense. A couple of weeks ago, I posted a poll on Facebook to address the growing interest among my listeners in two topics, and the results are in. The next mini-series here at Dragons and Genesis will be on the Book of Enoch, which means I have more books to purchase and material to read alongside my regular studies. And speaking of books, at the suggestion of a listener, my Amazon wish list for reference materials for this podcast is now on the Facebook page. If you want to help out the show, you can send me a book. Hardcover, softcover, Kindle, doesn't matter. I prefer printed books over digital, as it's easier to flip back and forth quickly. But when it comes to certain titles, especially out-of-print books, they can get kind of pricey. And I certainly wouldn't expect anyone to drop $100 for a paper copy when the Kindle version is a tiny fraction of that price. The wish list is a pinned post on facebook.com/dragonsandgenesis. So head over there and look at the top of the page. Also, check out the website at dragonsandgenesis.com, where you can find resources to further your own learning, along with a contacts page to send questions or comments, and a list of source material for this and all my other episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.